Are Indians smart?
What do we import from India? We import people, really smart people.
This is something I've had to live with ever since I was in school.
Indian of descent Americans are taking over the country.
In this video, I want to see if this stereotype is really true.
The best of the best, face to face. Steph and LeBron? No way. Rohan and Ananya.
Definition, please.
Language of origin.
Are Indians really smart?
Ah, dang it.
What makes Indian immigrants so successful? Now, while it's difficult to break down an entire lifestyle into points, let's look at some of the most obvious ones. Since the early 19th century, thousands of Indians made their way to the US in search of that American dream. I guess that house in a suburban community and a comfortable life. But their lives carved a slightly different path. The Indian American dream. Indian American families are considered the most successful immigrants in the US. They're in every industry. They're 8% of the founders of these high-tech companies. Their average income is double that of other Americans. So they're considered really hardworking people. There's a really interesting reason why Indians are so successful in the IT industry. I'll get there in a second.
What do you do when you're angry?
Math.
Okay, what about when you're sad?
Math.
Happy?
Math.
This is how the media hypes us up. People of my generation are now speaking up about these cultural expectations and standards. And if you're Indian, you know how much our upbringing is rooted in focusing on our studies. Most of us have done that little extra math on weekends and summer vacations, but I think to really understand where this mindset comes from, we have to take a tiny peek back to the motherland and the culture there. On my last trip to India, I noticed this mysterious set of women outside many temples. Some of them were like completely naked and fierce looking. I found out these women are goddesses known as the Dasha Mahavidyas, or the 10 forms of knowledge. A culture that has 10 goddesses for knowledge says a lot. So the entire culture was intensely focused toward gaining an inner knowledge. That's why even today, the South Asian approach is all about education. But there's a big difference now. Western education covers just one side of life: memorization and analytics. Eastern education addressed the entire body, mind, and spirit. They worked toward mastery over various holistic sciences. So these sciences were interwoven into our everyday life. For example, when I visited my grandmother earlier this year, Kerala is the beautiful state where I come from in South India. My visits here are often to my grandmother's house, where I get to eat her amazing cooking. The traditional Indian diet is really nutritious and really tasty too. Some scientists say that the use of turmeric, lentils, and other spices in Indian food is actually the reason why Indians have the lowest rate of Alzheimer's in the world. So I try to make Indian food at home, but it's nothing like eating it fresh from your grandmother's kitchen. I also had to speak a lot more Malayalam because my grandmother doesn't speak English. Unfortunately, I never officially learned another language in my childhood. It's difficult to explain the feeling, but a part of me felt like it was missing itself. So a few years ago, I started working on learning my mother tongue. Even though I can only speak in bits, it's amazing how my entire personality changes when I speak it. I'm sure there's a unique quality or character to every one of the 1,000 languages in the world. Maybe that's why they say that multilingual people are more flexible and able to understand things faster. With so many languages in India, most people who grow up there know at least 2 languages, if not more. So So does this mean that every Indian who eats Indian food and speaks an Indian language is really smart? There's all kinds of Indians, but the beauty of this land is that every town was a consecrated space. Many towns in India strategically planned a specific arrangement of temples. This small town has 81 temples in it, and these aren't just emotional or psychological comfort kind of places. Each temple has gone through a scientific process of prana pratishta, which energizes the deity and space. Together, the entire town reverberates with a kind of energy. I'll have to make another video on that. But the point of all this is, the ones who designed this whole way of life understood one thing very clearly. A cultured space like this nurtures people to expand their intelligence, perception, and creativity. In many places, this whole culture is sort of forgotten, but I wonder if it still helps people in some way. I recently read a passage in a book which mentioned how Indian-born corporate leaders have a blend of personal humility and intense professional will. The book advised this as the secret formula to transition into leadership positions. It's possible that this came from the devotion that the Indian culture nurtured for hundreds or thousands of years. That culture of devotion where we greet everyone by bowing down with a namaskar is how India was made. The legendary mathematician Ramanujan compiled around 4,000 mathematical theorems. He only lived until the age of 32, and it seems he had no real formal training in math. They say he started developing these theorems in isolation. He came from a traditional family, and he openly credited all his discoveries to his family goddess or Kuladevi. Her name is Namagiritaya in Namakkal. He described having seen a red screen formed by flowing blood, and a hand began to write elliptical integrals on the screen. He woke up and just started writing. Other mathematicians were floored by what he presented. When a deity is consecrated as per their traditional methods, it is a living force and guides one through life in unexplainable ways. Absolute devotion to deity has produced many such geniuses in India. But traditionally, the culture recognized that everyone has a spark of genius. They just set up a positive atmosphere for it to flower. Children grew up in joint family structures. More than the ABCs in school, they learned a lot from their elders, stories from decades of life and experience. This wisdom empowered them without having to go through all the situations themselves. That could also be why my family elders were always telling our heroes and heroines were Rama, Sita, Krishna, and Radha. How gracefully they went through life in spite of all the hurdles. It lived in our hearts and minds. Today, many of society's heroes are hugely violent, emotionally volatile, so it's no surprise that we see negativity and violence in children. These things were so beautifully taken care of for us from our childhood. So why are Indians so successful, especially in the IT industry? I think it's because our culture is built on looking at the building blocks of life. That's essentially what coding is, right? Like you translate big ideas into smaller building blocks and put it together to create a result. Our culture enshrines that focus, precision, and accuracy that's needed. And this isn't an Indian bias. If you look closely at almost any native culture, the culture that was there before colonization, when people still lived in tune with the earth, they all had this deep sense of intelligence and intuition. So while the stereotype can be a bit of pressure at times, be Indian for me is the most ambiguous identity of my life because it doesn't put you in any box like any other identity. It only gives you this freedom to explore life in all its profundity and depth.